Hi everyone, my name is Mijay Gula. I am the gallery curator for the Interior Architecture Department. I'm here to introduce a very good friend, John Preus. John and I have worked together for, I don't know, we've worked together back in 2011, and I follow his work closely. So I'm really happy to bring him to our school and for him to introduce his work to you guys. He's going to be speaking about a new topic, things that he's been writing about for a very long time, but maybe this is the first lecture? Yep. So be happy, guys. Let's see. So, okay, John's going to give a talk and a lecture on this topic, and then he and I will be in conversation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. So, to introduce John, John Preus has developed his multidisciplinary practice from roots in both painting and furniture making, and this remains a predominant lens through which to view his work. As a descendant of Norwegian Lutheran pastors going back 6 generations, Preus's deep understanding of generosity, sacrifice, and community infuse his approach as an artist and a creative citizen. It's a new title I gave John, Creative Citizen. So for over 10 years, John has been deeply involved in building and fostering creative citizen spaces. And so this is spaces built as art, but accessible and free for public use and activation. John is a co-founder of the Southside Hub of Production in Chicago with Laura Schaefer and Material Exchange with Sarah Black. He collaborated with Yaster Gates on the Dorchester projects and was project lead for 12 ballads of the Huguenot House at Documenta 13. This is a culmination of a 6-year collaboration with Yaster. His recent exhibitions, Infinite Games 50/50, demonstrates his inclusivity and collaborative work with multidisciplinary artists, through which objects were made with salvage materials from the massive closings of Chicago public schools back in 2013. His work, through this material, has acted as an open invitation to catalyze further conversations on social issues around race, class, and education equity. Please join me in welcoming John Preus to the Mitchell Lecture Series and the School of the Art Institute.
Thank you, Mijay. Made me sound like a very good person. So I just wanted to thank Mijay, Jonathan, Ryan, all the folks here for inviting me. First of all, it's a real honor. And I'm going to talk, I'm going to try and make an arc for the Infinite Games project, where the flyers you all see on the chairs there is a portion of that show is going to end up here, opening October 22nd. It's a smaller space, so it'll be an excerpt from that original exhibition. So in a way, a lot of the talk is focused on that body of work. But I've generally talk about slides as they come up. I'm just going to let them scroll and really talk about the ideas that I feel have really informed the work that I've been doing for many, many years. And hopefully it'll make sense in relation to the images as they're scrolling. And then at the end, when Mijay and I are done talking, we can take some time to do a Q&A if people want to ask specific questions about some of the projects. So I'm going to start with a thought image. I'm going to read a little bit, so hope don't put you to sleep. Thought image. Imagine an endless space with no things in it, in which you can run forever in any direction toward a nondescript horizon, the same in every direction. Pure, unadulterated nothingness. Now imagine an opposite landscape filled with stuff, a pack rat's paradise full of things and objects, crowded with people, but that all of them are equally important to you. Even a lawnmower moves you with the same intensity of your beloved. I propose that these are both hellscapes on either side of a spectrum of attachment, and illustrates the necessity of things as a medium of existence. So I wanted to talk a bit about the seductiveness of objects and things. Objects clearly call out to us selectively, and the question of what is worthy of our attention becomes an important question, as if we think of objects and things as a means of moderating attachments, a means of moderating relationships between people. All fashion, all design, all art, all religion, advertising, dating apps are all essentially saying, hey, look over here. This is important and worthy of your attention. Thing theory is a term coined by Bill Brown, a University of Chicago scholar, is based to some degree on philosopher Martin Heidegger's monumental work, Being in Time, which in a sense speculates about how we calibrate relationships. The idea of thrownness is a theme that comes up, right? Like he's in a sense arguing against the idea that first there's matter and then that eventually builds up to consciousness. In a sense, we develop consciousness long before we have any awareness of things or thingness. And so, in a sense, he's privileging the idea of the relational being as primary rather than, our physical matter. So, and then if we think of this spectrum of attachment, like on one end of it is the fetish object or something that we get utterly attached to, and in a way, sexuality is the driving force that draws us toward certain things and away from others. I read somewhere that in a neurology book or something that a damage to a certain part of the brain that affects your sex drive also affects the ability to make any choices whatsoever, right? So it's not just it's like those are all linked together. So in thing theory, there's a distinction made between objects and things. An object is camouflaged by its function, and this is something Heidegger talks a lot about. So, for instance, when you're using a glass or a fork or something, you're not really paying attention to the material nature of the fork so much. It's just serving a function for you. You're using it to do a thing, to do something specific. A thing, conversely, is something that stops you, that retards time, that slows everything down. And it demands that you pay attention to it specifically. And there's a way in which design is sort of more calibrated to objects and art more calibrated to things, right? Just as a loose, so good design, like an iPhone, for instance, is supposed to go unnoticed. Like you're aware of what it does for you, not what it looks like so much. Whereas an art object slows us down, we create all this space around it so that you have this singular interaction with the thing on the wall or the thing on the pedestal. So I've spent a fair amount of time thinking about the ready-made as this kind of confusing object in that regard. I assume many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with Marcel Duchamp, and maybe with his famous urinal that was on a pedestal. It's become a kind of canonical object. And part of why it's so interesting is that it confuses this object-thing paradigm, and by demanding a kind of attention for mundane things that were once reserved for special things, right? brings into question what makes something special. And this again gets back to the Heidegger notion. Is it quality of an object, or is it a quality of a relationship that makes something special? So he's there's another U of C scholar, W.J.T. Mitchell, who wrote a book, What Do Pictures Want? And he's kind of flipping the agency on its head. So it's the thing, the picture that wants something from us. What would that look like? And in a way, many religions prior to our historical framework are based on this notion of vitalism, of spirit being inside of things rather than in us that we then attribute to the things. So he's sort of playing with a secular version of this idea of vitalism. So if we ask with Mitchell, what would this toilet rather be used as a toilet, or would it rather be sitting on a pedestal? The ready-made proposes things are special by virtue of the frame or the pedestal itself. And I think there's a split that happens in art history based on this moment. So there are all these different means of a thing becoming special. For us caring about a thing or not caring about a thing. And one way this shows up in a funny way in art is, I remember having a conversation with Theaster Gates when I was working with him, and we would make these objects in the shop that would take, a certain amount of time, and then they sold for an amount of money that had very little correlation to time and materials, right? Like there's something else going on there. The authorship becomes the vehicle of value, the fact that he did it. Even though he didn't do it, there was a bunch of guys in the shop doing it, right? And so I used to joke with him, well, what if you made something for me? What would happen? And I thought, well, that would be an interesting object. How about I pay you an hourly rate and you make a thing for me, and then I'll hang it up, and what would be the difference in value? And it's extreme, right? Like, and that's what I'm arguing in my paper is a religious problem. So if it's not the object, but the relationship to the person who authored the object that becomes critical, I argue that this is a transposition of religious values into the cultural sphere. It's not an accident that museums and galleries feel a bit like church. Hence, and since then, relational aesthetics, for instance, privileges the engagement with an object as opposed to the quality of the object itself. So this opens up a set of problems that are interesting. The dilemma is that on the one hand, some objects want to be ignored, to be used effortlessly without the slightest attention to their thingness, a seamless extension of our bodies like the blind man's cane, while other things are designed to pull us up short, to create friction and smoke, and interrogate the numbing orthodoxy of the mundane. Clearly we need both. And maybe like to personify these various attachment pathologies, maybe we probably all know people that I would think of as utopian romanticists, where everything is too important. Everything just takes on this, if you hear about a starving kid somewhere or dolphins getting caught in fishing nets, I mean, it's like the world's about to end, and everything affects them at a very deep emotional level. And on the other end of the spectrum would be a nihilist who nothing touches. You just can't ever, seems to be no connection to other people or other objects, or, it's kind of a thing unto themselves. So what about objects that confuse these relationships? What's the difference, for instance, between drinking from a cup, drinking from the cup that was touched by the lips of Christ, or Bob Marley, or Marcel Duchamp? Or what about eating your dinner off a table that was made from timbers salvaged from a church that was burned down by white supremacists? Some associations are too much. How much trauma can be reappropriated, and by whom? So there's a dimension to our attachment to materials that also has a ritual function. When I the function of a ritual might be to, in some cases, break an attachment, right? Like I did this ritual for myself when my marriage ended. I burned a photograph of my wife and I, and it hurt like sticking my hand in a fire, but it felt important. So there's a sort of therapeutic dimension to these ritual relationships to things and images. And Mitchell tells a story about in his classes, he asks his students to take out a photograph of somebody they care about, a girlfriend or a parent, and scratch out the eyes. And of course, nobody does it, right? Like maybe the sociopaths among us would do it, but there's a reason that we don't want to do that. We know that this photograph materially bears absolutely no relationship to the person, but it somehow bears this kind of vitalistic attachment, where you feel like if you're scratching out the eyes, you're injuring the relationship, or you're injuring the person in the photograph. So I said this thing object relationship isn't fixed, right? Like there's a way in which everything's always trying to be something else. Things are always moving, changing. Morphology is happening all around us. We're becoming something else as we speak. In a sense, transformation is the great religious preoccupation as well as the political one. I would say the art cult and the religion cult offer somewhat different recipes for how to change. I'm going to read a little section here. Just like the alchemists who wanted to turn lead into gold, just like the farmer who wants to turn seed into food, identity is more essentially aligned with who we want to become than who we already are. The poet admires the simple dedication of the laborer, who loves the agility of the athlete, who wants to be more like his father, who lives for his children, who loves superheroes and princesses because they fight for the common man, who admires the wealth and bling of the aristocrat and the celebrity, who longs for the adoration of the masses but who is lost in the mystification of her own image, which she knows can't be true. And so it goes, each of us in turn longing to be something else, something more, something greater, according to the image that most securely lodges itself into our psyche. So this begs the question of transformation from what into what? How do things get better or worse? Christianity says be more like Jesus. Art says be interesting. They both propose a measure of how to change, but in both cases the amount of ambiguity in the model is not insignificant. Jesus was a somewhat opaque figure. And who are the arbiters who can tell us who is interesting, who we should be paying attention to, who gets to be on the pedestal? That the image is seductive is obvious enough. Just doing research on this now is fascinating. In 2017, the human race made a grand total of 28.5 billion visits to Pornhub, clocking in 81 million daily average visits to the site. This is interesting. It's just a picture, right? And responses to the seductivity of the image vary widely in religious history, from the pictorial lushness of Hinduism and Christianity to the aniconic religious traditions of Islam and Judaism, in which representational images are largely forbidden, understood to be idolatrous. Why does this matter? If only to show that the worry that I am expressing here is a long-standing one, and to point to the existence of an established vocabulary for thinking about the problem. What sorts of images grab us and won't let go? Draw us more deeply into our own nature, so to speak, or our fears and defenses and attachments? What sorts of things and images project us out into the world and invite us to value and appreciate our tenuous hold on materiality and the fragile bonds of human relationships? What images help us to be kind and loving and generous and so forth while not consigning ourselves to poverty? There's no functional difference between a pin-up of a busty woman holding a power tool, a row of gleaming cars in an auto lot, perfectly stacked fruits and vegetables on a farmer's market table, a baboon's bright red ass, an array of stained glass windows flooding the interior of a cathedral sanctuary with color that washes over everything inside of it, etc. The role of the thing in all of these cases is to seduce, to capture our attention. What it wants to capture our attention for is what's in question. The religious encourage personal and moral growth through acts of sacrifice reinforced with shame and guilt. The cultural through acts of indulgence, also reinforced through shame and guilt, strangely enough. So I see art history not as a break from religious tradition, but as a continuation of it, an elaboration upon religious practice, not a rejection of it. The ready-made is the art world's equivalent of the communion wine turned blood of Christ, unaltered, unadorned, unlabored, and unvarnished, simply consecrated by the pedestal and the institutional frames and rituals that embraced it. One either believes in its transfiguration or not. Art has become the theological wing of the Academy, thanks to Marcel Duchamp and his willing canonization. Art since Duchamp can be seen as a largely iconoclastic discourse. Iconoclasm being the rejection of imagery in religious practice. It's heir to the Judaic and Islamic mistrust of representation. Fountain, the urinal on the pedestal, can be seen as a sort of Rorschach test, and, which with, I think, interesting political relationships or associations. Imagine a poll that asked, is Fountain A canonical work of art, or B, a sick joke? And then, you know, the world breaks down, and according to which side of that, whether you're A or B. It's as if art history concedes the necessity of faith but quibbles about its object. Maybe what most concerns me is that Duchamp knocked the white-bearded, ill-tempered, genocidal biblical God off of the throne only to replace it with something infinitely more fickle, namely the cultural elite. I'm not going to go too far into this, but there's a... If you imagine a kind of classes of objects, like No, these were big arguments in church history, whether you can use icons in religious practice or not. I mean, they'd fight wars over these things and have big conferences and so forth. People would get burned at the stake, and in one view is that all images are just too seductive. There's the line between an icon and an idol is so vanishingly thin that it's just not worth taking the risk, right? But obviously we come from a different tradition. Art is contemporary Western art is in some ways heir to the Catholic or Christian Enlightenment tradition. So a conservative sensibility might say that a religious icon is intended to be a representation of the attributes of God as understood by the powers that be and the interpretation of the artist, the adoption of which were time-tested throughout human history to cultivate healthy communal life, some complex elaboration of ritual and image. But, like every other system, it is corruptible. In religion, most notoriously due to the dogmatic attachment to the text. Modernism's theology asserts that things can just be what they are. Paint means paint, wood means wood, cement means cement. Why demand that it means something else? Isn't there something true just about what things are? Yes, that is. There is a truth to that, but it's susceptible to the problem of value, of what makes anything legitimately more important than anything else. Is it okay to love your own children more than someone else's? Is it okay to care about your friends more than other people? What does it mean to love your enemies, as the Christian idea suggests? Is it better if rather than a church, some other powerful institution decides for us what it is that we should be paying attention to, by owning and controlling the pedestals? What is material anyway? Neither objects, things, materials, nor people are ever just what they seem. And there are dangers attendant to thinking that they are. In religion and myth, things are always turning into other things. Water can be wine, wine can be blood, pigs can be gods, and demons, and so on. Likewise, artists turn mud into faces, trees into tables, dirt and stone into pigments, pigment into scenes of forests and dancing elves. And more recently, much like the priestly maneuver of turning wine into the blood of Christ, the pedestal within the magic halls of the museum can turn a toilet into an object of veneration. Furthermore, surgery may be the most radical in some senses and very conventional in others. Sculptural practice of our time can turn women into men and vice versa. It gives new meaning to Joseph Beuys's phrase, social sculpture. Identity has become a sort of theatrical and sculptural paradigm, a performative quotation. Maybe it always was, equally beholden as any other representation to its context in history. What does it mean to be a woman or a man without an internalized, socially and historically contingent image? Art has long concerned itself with surface, with what is seen and what is hidden. Surface both obscures and reveals. We are enmeshed, and as always we will be, in a battle of competing images. We exist in part by being seen. We are assaulted by images. They override consent on every level. We cannot unsee the images that penetrate us. Every moment is a shower of arrows piercing our neural space and demanding our attention until we close our eyes in sleep, when the unconscious further assaults us with the daily overflow of unprocessed imagery. So the idea that a generation of abstraction would somehow save us from the overwhelming power of the image is noble, but sort of silly. We're creatures of the image, of things, of material. We exist in them, for them, and through them, and they us. We are contingencies upon contingencies, turtles all the way down. So this brings me to the materials I have been working with recently. In 2013, Chicago closed 49 public schools, and through some strange set of circumstances, I ended up with a warehouse full of the material. And sort of like Duchamp's fountain, there's a lot of different ways to think about this material and the associations that are embedded in it. And I just, a few thoughts I had. Is it more like the cup touched by the lips of Elvis, or the heirloom piece of furniture passed down from one generation to the next, maintaining family history? A chunk of the Berlin Wall? Or is it more like a trove of elephant tusks confiscated from a poacher? Is it a historical moment in the unraveling of a social institution giving way to some other model? What will become of public education? How might we consider the problem as a question about the nature of human development? Education is both a design problem and a vision problem. It requires an idea about what humans are and could become given the best possible conditions, and a model of how to set up those conditions amidst the inherited chaos of past failures, amidst the Heideggerian condition of thrownness. We're always dealing with what the last generation didn't quite get right. The material itself is burdened with this discourse, not to mention the immaterial aura and energy of the innocent kids caught in the crossfire of our attempts to educate them. My personal conversation with the material goes in both directions, toward the functional and the symbolic, toward thingness and objecthood, toward vision and equipment. So that question, dispose or expose? I see the process of playing with material as something like imagine there's something about the city's garbage that's similar to how Freud describes the unconscious. It's in a sense a latent collection of failed attachments, right? Things that we thought we wanted or needed, or maybe did, and then broke, and then we got rid of them. And they pile up all around us, and they're circulating around our planet. So I imagine playing with the city's garbage is something like an act of a collective ritual, or kind of collective therapeutic possibilities. It proposes a sort of transubstantiation, a transformation of social energy. It strikes me as both tender and violent to manipulate materials that bear such deep collective pathos, consecrated by the political battles that surrounded the closing of the schools. There's a collective trauma embedded in it, and what is trauma? There's a lot of interesting theory around what that is and how it expresses itself individually and collectively. Things happen to us all the time. Trauma, unrequited love, ecstasy, abandonment, abuse, joy, love, boredom, before our capacity to synthesize it. This is as true of groups as it is of individuals. The unconscious is a sort of fictive internal landscape in which the frictions and sticking points of our relationships play themselves out in narrative form and bodily symptoms. There are parts of our character, our wastefulness, our neglect, our blind spots, our prejudices that we might ignore if not for the violence that erupts in their wake. Operates like hydraulic pressures, activating behavioral valves and destructive social machinery. So the therapist is something like a historian who uncovers, discloses aspects of our nature that might be opaque to us. Like we have a certain behavior, we don't know why we're doing it. Therapist kind of helps us figure out what's down there. And then, but it's not just exposing the trauma, so to speak. It's also recasting that in a narrative framework that we take some control over. So, as Jacques Lacan put it, the best a therapist can do is restore the illusion of agency through a kind of narrative mechanism. Authorship, even. You know, we are authors of our lives in a way, right? So psychoanalysis might be described as something like the redemptive fabrication of personal identity drawn from the circumstances of one's inheritance. Psychoanalysis tries to reframe identity as proclaimed rather than given, as performed rather than predestined, as composed rather than inherited. Can we imagine public and civic spaces populated by the reimagined detritus of past traumas, preserved in our daily lives in both functional and symbolic form, something like composting the rotting material to keep the new growth healthy? Is there value to keeping our beautiful failures in front of us where we can see them? I'm speculating that there's some correlation between the energy it might take to unthink chair and the energy it might take to unthink destructive power dynamics. I try to create things and spaces that are at once symbolic and functional, both image and object, both material and ephemeral, images that consume us, so to speak, and we in turn give them life. So some labels that I've tried to think of what something like the Beast would be, is a temporary chapel of speculative possibility, or civic center for the collision of values, a confederacy of naked emperors. So Duchamp conjured a world that admired toilets on pedestals. He transferred the reins of mystification from the church to the cultural sphere, which rather than creating a universe of creative freedom was immediately consumed by the economic sphere. Money is the triumph of abstraction, in which relationships can be almost entirely transactional. Friendship, sex, love, all instrumentalized as social capital. We live in a world obsessed with frames and pedestals. Advertising is nothing if not the platform upon which functionally indistinguishable objects vie for our attention. Capitalism is the economy of the pedestal. Social media is the platform upon which we perform our identity for an audience of peers. So what is possible in this long and venerable line of transformative ambitions that span the length of history, if we give our attention to an unlikely cache of materials tattooed with the resistance of high school and elementary students, with a history of civic neglect and underrepresentation? What would the kids do with the materials given the opportunity? I imagine the process as a psychoanalytic template. Would it have been better to just let the materials be taken to the landfill to avoid the problem of political toxicity, to be transformed instead by heavy equipment and microorganisms, impartial to our social dilemmas? And we might fairly wonder if a wealth of artwork about poverty or race, let's say, washed up on the shores of Expo this year, could we expect a corresponding drop in actual poverty or improved race relations? Finally, to paraphrase Slavoj Žižek in his critique of academicism, Dialogue can serve to assure that nothing changes. And art, if it replaces religion as the machine of mystification, as brutal and violent in its ideology as the church ever was, in my view, the great Christian insight, amplified by Duchamp, is that maybe we already have everything we need. And transubstantiation, the turning of wine into blood, is not a physical transformation at all, requiring miraculous powers, but a subtle shift in perspective. You have to believe in a black square or a urinal or the transformative capacities of a broken chair to find it valuable and worthy of your time and energy, just like you have to believe the communal wine is blood for it to have any currency. The primary question remains, can we compose a story compelling, collective, and rugged enough to resist rendering a significant portion of the world's population, human and otherwise, invisible, banished to the sidelines of our finite games? Thank you. Hello? Okay.
So we we have a little setup here. I don't know for folks in the back row if they can see our little awesome setup, but I invited John to actually bring in some of his work. Specifically, are these all objects from the closed Chicago Public Schools?
Predominantly, yes.
So it's 2 stools, 2 cubes, and a side table, coffee table. Mm-hmm. Reason I invited John to, encouraged John to bring this, and he was totally for immediately when I asked, is because he creates like a lot of the work that I've seen, and also that you are showing right now. You create these platforms for which art can be activated, right? Like, I'm allowed to sit on your artwork. I'm allowed to write and work on your artwork, right? And that's this barrier that I always hated about art. There's this like complete social disconnection, right? Yeah. And almost a class disconnection too. Yeah. So can we go to the image of the beast in Hyde Park? Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ryan. So this was in 2014, and this was at the Hyde Park Art Center. And this is from inside the gallery, the view inside the gallery. And I remember hearing about this awesome, extremely large solo show, and I was really excited to see, images of you building it, and I wanted to see it in person. And I remember the first thing, you talk about imagery a lot, and like the power of image, it relating to like icons and idols. And so like for me, but when I first encountered this image, right, of this bull, it didn't strike me as much, right? Like I listened to several interviews and conversations you've had with philosophers about the imagery of the bull can represent, the bull as a sacred animal. Maybe it symbolizes sacrifice, or it could be also this idea of like power and charging and Chicago Bulls, etc. For me, I've always lived in Chicago my entire life, and I didn't really connect to this image at all. Like for me, what struck me the most was the actual materials that you used, the materials in which you built this entire massive structure out of salvage materials from 49 closed schools. And for me, like I'm a product of CPS, and I think that's what kind of like shook me the most. Yeah. That symbol was most powerful, and in a way, it was really hard for me to contend with this, right? Because it was like this idea of like waste, this very sad moment, very shameful, this moment of like abandonedness. There was like these weird feelings I was getting, and like the closer I got to the actual felt fabric in which you've covered this bull with, which is actually carpeting or padding from carpeting, like so it's like just imagining tons of children who used this and walked upon it, and now it's within this art space for me, which art is so it's already such a huge social barrier. I was really confused. Can we go to the next image? But I was really excited to actually see, like, to go inside. I was almost relieved to feel like this new reinterpretation of the materials, right? And in a way, it was more that if I experienced the space empty, I would still feel that sadness. But because it was filled with community that was activating the space, it created this new energy, this new revival, right? So I don't know. I mean, acquiring these materials, when you acquire these materials in 2013, I'm imagining you're walking into a warehouse or a closed public school, and you are faced with piles of books, maybe abandoned books, piles of children's desks and chairs, and you must have experienced a sense of weight, right, and accountability, because here you are going to acquire these things that were, in my opinion, unrightfully taken, and you're going to make something new out of it. Like, I want to ask you, like, how did you deal with that level of accountability, and how did these materials, after acquiring them, completely transform your work?
I think my relationship to the material developed over time, and at first it just seemed to me a shame that all this stuff was just going to get thrown away. I had initially gone to one of the schools like with a car. I was just going to grab a handful of things that looked interesting, and I think the fact that this was such an enormous closing seemed really significant to me. It seemed like a kind of a paradigmatic shift and it makes me wonder, like, what's going to happen with education. I think it's changing, and it feels to me like this is a chapter in what will become a larger institutional structural change in how we think about education. Hopefully some good comes out of that too. But it just struck me as both a intensely historical moment, but then all of these materials are also layered with, very singular human interactions, relationships, people saying things that people they love or hate, scrawled into desks and so forth. So there are all these really individualized relationships to the material itself. And I think my initial thought was, I want to hold on to this until something I can think of something interesting to do with it. I didn't know, and I just happened to find somebody who could store it for me. If I'd had to pay for storage, there's no way I could have done it. So he generously offered the space. And I was using it just a little bit at a time. I mean, if quite a few of you here have been to the warehouse and seen how much there is, and I've done all these projects with this stuff, and it doesn't seem to decrease the supply. So in my own work, I thought it was, in a way, I was thinking of it as something like a memorial, where it's just like sort of slowly trickles back out into people's daily lives, both functionally and symbolically, and it's like a reminder that this happened, a reminder of this time, a reminder of the kids that used it. But it's problematic. I mean, it borders on that level of, like I described the burned down church. Like, you wouldn't want to eat your dinner off of that table. Like, there's something, there's bordering on that kind of pathos, which troubles me and continues to trouble me. But I think the conversations I've had with it, and like the way the Beast ended up, the way the community took that project up was hugely gratifying, and in some ways felt like it gave me permission to keep using the material, because like when the Beast was taken down, there were tears. The kids really took it on as their space, and a lot of the programming that happened in the space was just the kids that were down there. You know, they started this spoken word open mic thing. They had meetings in there. They used it like their hangout after school. So it took on a real significant social dimension for them. And I think in a way they seemed really excited about the fact that, oh, he took all this junk out of the schools and now they're surrounded by it, but it's their space. They have agency over the space. So in a way, I think that felt like it gave me permission to keep using it in that way. And, you know, and it enters into a lot of different social and economic trajectories. And
Can I interrupt?
yeah.
Okay. On that note, about how community has when inhabiting this space, that's how they've been able to create these programs. But what about other public response? I mean, there's still this resonating trauma for many families, teachers, and youth that maybe not necessarily like Chicago-wide, maybe they haven't had a chance to attend any of these programs. What have been the public response to you as an artist acquiring these materials, and what you are, and making art out of them?
I mean, at some level, it's hard to gauge that, right? Like, if people that are bothered by it generally don't tell me so. I think mostly the people that like it tell me so. So, I'm biased. But the one encounter that I've had that was not positive was with some CPS teachers in response to there was a WBEZ program that Linda Lutton, some of you might know, she has been following the school closing story for quite a few years, and it's kind of on the education beat. So she did a story about it, and she interviewed me and walked through the Infinite Game show, and she interviewed one of the teachers who responded to my use of the material. And thought I was being very irresponsible and hurtful, insensitive. And so my response was to try and engage with her and have a conversation about it, and she wasn't particularly open to that, so kind of cut it off. But I'm sure there are more people out there who would think that. And I think part of the impulse of the Infinite Game show was it is a question, like what's the right thing to do with the material, right? I don't think anybody would be like, maybe we should have just thrown it away, right? Like that was where it was going to go, because it's so politically toxic. But the impulse to invite a bunch of other people to work with it was just a way of saying, I don't really know how to answer that question. What do you think? And people took it in a lot of different directions, and some of those images have been scrolling by of that exhibition. Some of those things will be up in the EIO gallery. Yeah, so I don't think it's an easy question to answer, and I don't think it's answerable in the end. And I guess I hope that the responses, if nothing else, they keep the conversation happening.
So this year, the Beast has been reimagined in Montserrat. except instead of building the structure out of CPS materials, you built it out of local boat materials, like abandoned or old boats. Can you talk about that? I'm finding interest in the fact that you're using, again, this power of materials that are local and resonant for the community that you're creating a space for. What was their response? And now looking at some of the images, what was their response to seeing some of these slabs of boat pieces, boat siding, and creating that space? But also, like, I've noticed in some of these photos that you have CPS materials like chairs, and did they respond to that, given that it's so distant of a topic?
I think broadly speaking, just like the overarching premise of the project in general, is a way in which I thought bringing some of the things that had come from the original stock of material that inspired the Beast in the first place, it's sort of a way to connect those projects. Obviously, the imagery is connected also, but their response was similar. It's similarly enthusiastic and sad. I mean, in a way, the sadness on their part was that there's this very long-standing shipping and fishing industry out there that's, slowly deteriorating because of all kinds of things. The water's not as clean anymore. It's overfished, and there's big, huge ships that do the job now, and so a way of life has kind of it hangs on in a sort of touristic way, like there's people ride around on boats all the time for fun, but it's not really a thriving industry in the way that it was. So a lot of the material, in a way, I sometimes think of material as something like you drip water on a color and it bleeds all over the place, and it's something like that, I think, where the material itself just inspires these conversations and stories to emerge, and in a way the space inside of it, like maybe a really simplistic equation would be you make the thing out of the stuff that has a sort of local significance, and then you build a space within which the stuff permeates all the conversations that happen inside of it. And does that create the possibility for kinds of conversations that may not happen otherwise? And the response has been an overwhelming yes.
So thinking about the Beast in Montserrat, also Infinite Games within the Open House Contemporary, and even the Beast at Hyde Park Art Center, you're creating these social spaces, but within an art space setting. I know that Hyde Park, you allowed it to bleed open because it had large open doors, and that allowed for the public passing by to just spill in. They didn't have to go through the lobby or anything like that. And that was really nice. But I still feel like this work, like creating a social space, needs to be freer than that, right? Like it needs to be more accessible. Again, like I was saying, like I feel like art spaces have such barriers, and create such barriers for folks that have you ever thought about freeing the Beast? Have you ever thought about like allowing it to be in a true public space, fully accessible, to be activated? I'm not sure what you're thinking about future.
That would be perfect. That would be ideal. I mean, and I think in a way, was this the year of public art or whatever? It seems to me like the city could fairly easily designate one building in every single ward that is an open art space for people to do this sort of thing in. It would be so easy, I think, and probably not all that expensive. There are all kinds of things like that cities could do to create the conditions for a much more open and free art art set of relationships to make them possible, right? Expo's great, but it costs a lot of money to get in there.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pain in the ass to get over there. And finding ways for engaging, exciting, complex art projects to be out in the public in ways where people can just stumble upon them, I think is the sign of a healthy city.
Mm-hmm.
And we have some good stuff here for sure, but I think there are a lot of other things we could do. And hell yeah, I would love to do a big beast that's just out in the world. I don't know.
Okay. How about we open this for questions? Does anyone have a question for John?
There's a mic right here.
Oh, sorry.
I was just curious about, like, sort of the topic of the beast at the Hyde Park and how you took that materials from a place that was just ended up getting thrown away. What happened to the remainders of the beast at the Hyde Park Art Center? Where do they reside now?
Where did the material go after?
Yeah.
I took it back. I still have it.
It's just back in the pile.
Yeah, back in the pile.
And I was also kind of wondering, do you just give out that material as well to other people in the community?
I have, yeah. Yeah, a lot of it, and people
Mhm.
borrow it a
Yeah.
lot, and and I'd love to do more of that, but again, it's like it's a kind of a nightmare. I
Mhm.
don't have time to be driving stuff
Yeah.
all over the city just to give to people, and a lot of people can't come and pick it up or meet me at my warehouse space. I mean, there are just all these logistical problems about that. But I'm doing a residency at the Smart Museum for the next year, and I'm trying to. So we're having conversations about they're now storing all this material down there, and we're trying to figure out what to do with it next. Yeah.
This title, Interpreter in Residence, what does that mean?
I don't know. I don't know. You have to interpret it.
I guess I have another question. So, did the material find you, or did you seek the material?
It found me.
In both times, or in all times?
Most of the time.
Yeah.
I mean, anybody that works with found material, I mean, you pretty quickly, there's so much stuff out there. It's just like finding stuff is never hard. Storing it is the hard part.
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe getting it from point A to point B.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
This kind of relates to your Christian beliefs, sort of. I was wondering.
I wasn't advocating Christian beliefs, but I mean, I'm not speaking as a Christian.
Okay. No. Yeah. Okay. I'll still ask, but I mean, you don't have to answer, I guess. Are you concerned at all, if there's any contradictions between the typical kind of intentional devaluing of objects and physical worldly items versus intentionally giving them kind of more credit than what people would typically give them? Do you ever encounter any I don't know, I guess contradictions between those two ideas?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So you talked a little bit about how people relate to objects using their sexuality, kind of fetishizing about the objects.
That's one way on a spectrum of attachments. Yeah, that's one
Okay.
end of the spectrum.
So is it a concern at all for people to relate to your objects with those similar ideas. And
Definitely, yeah.
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 Would you say that it's like a misinterpretation if they do that?
Well, I mean, like I would consider that a condition of thrownness, right? Like that's the world that we live in and operate in, that people do that with things. And to some degree you can resist that, and to some degree you can try and you can try to develop conditions that would make that harder. But as an artist, to some degree, doing that is shooting yourself in the foot in terms of actually making a living as an artist or developing a career as an artist, right? So I think is a fragile and very uncomfortable line to walk there. And I think part of what I'm writing about, I touched on a little bit, is this idea of mystification, and how, in a way, part of what made the church both so powerful and so dangerous was having control over this set of mystified images and objects, which I think now the art world has, and they're, based on the value of these objects, tremendous amounts of influence. And there's nothing about the object itself that's of any value whatsoever, right? It's a collective attachment fetish, right? And there's some good things about it and some not so good things about it, and which I've been thinking a lot about. But my objects just fall into that landscape, and there's nothing I can do about that.
Okay, so then I guess I have one more question after that. So if there's no inherent value in these objects, like the found objects, why use the old materials from the school if a carpet is just a carpet is just a carpet? What's the contrast there, I guess?
Well, I mean, for me to say there's no value in an object is kind of it's not true, right? I mean, I'm describing a existential human conundrum. There's nothing inherently valuable about gold, say, right? Why it's worth so much, I don't really know. But it's kind of a collective agreement. We all decided these things are worth this much, and that's what markets are, basically. They're orthodoxies. They're orthodoxies that govern the value of things in relation to other things. In a world where things in and of themselves don't really have values, we confer value upon them. But I don't think entirely, right? I don't think you can confer as much value as you like onto anything that you want, right? There is some relationship to a kind of function. What does this thing do for us? And I think that's what's so interesting about the conversation between the object-thing distinction. So,
can I ask one more question? Okay. Do you feel like you confer any more value to the objects that you find and use in your artwork? And then how does kind of that translate when you put the materials back, or when you're done with the installation per se?
I do. I mean, just by virtue of the fact that I chose them, I'm valuing them more than the thing that I didn't choose. And actually did a project earlier with Sarah Black, I don't know if she's here, where we made these objects that went into the MCA that were made out of the MCA's garbage, right? So the stuff they were throwing out, we put it back in as an art object, and then part of the project was every day somebody would take one of the objects out. But to take them out, they had to put white gloves on, and they had to sign a bunch of papers, right? So it's just playing with that cultural pedestal, so to speak. Yeah.
Do you think there's kind of a naked grammar for the seductive image, or is it completely subjective, or
Is there a naked grandma?
Like you know the metaphor I'm giving out about just kind of like like a kind of negative of the seductive image, or do you think that would be very subjective as the seductiveness of the image would be subjective?
Yeah, like I think there are kind of biological templates that we generally are locked into in certain ways. Like, I think there's a like attractiveness, beauty, seduction. Those things are to some degree malleable, definitely, and socially constructed. But I also feel like there's a biological function at work there also that puts certain limits on that.
So what do you think the opposite of a seductive image would be?
What
Just
would
like-
it be?
Yeah, would it just be very uncomfortable, like one of those like you see on the internet? It's like supposed to, these colors are all supposed to be the same, but there's one like shade that's dissimilar. Do you think that would be like the opposite, or do you think it would be something else entirely?
A repulsive image.
Yes.
Yeah.
But can't somebody find something subductive in that, like a Francis Bacon painting?
Uh-huh. Yeah, well, I mean, in a way, like, especially modern history of art is playing with that line. Like, how far can you cross it before something gets repulsive? And once something is repulsive for 20 years, does it become beautiful all of a sudden, right? And we've seen that happen over and over again, where I think, for instance, the bad painting era. I think there's plenty of us now that look at that era of painting and think it's pretty beautiful in a way. So those things can shift, definitely, but I don't think they shift quickly.
Yeah, I have a quick question. First off, thank you very much for your words and your work. I appreciate it. I'm
Thank you.
curious about the relationship of your aesthetics to your kind of mission to engage public education in the city. Because to me, the big difference I see is the relationship between your work, which is collage-y, right, versus the aesthetics of a lot of my contemporaries who are architects or teachers in the city who, by whatever reason, have to go work for a firm who are designing charter schools, or they work as teachers in charter schools. And the charter school forms become really crisp and kind of perfect in a sense, and then the charter school teachers have to, teach their students to go to college right away, and they wear uniforms, and it's all very dialed in, which seems to be in marked contrast to your collage aesthetic, which on first glance might kind of run towards ruin porn a little bit, but I wonder if you have something else to say about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I like to imagine a school in which all of the furniture in it was completely individualized, and maybe the kids made their own desks and cobbled them together out of whatever was around. I have to think more deeply about that connection, my own aesthetic in relation to the social objective. I mean, I feel uneasy talking about that. I think in part because it's so easy to collapse it into a kind of fixed equation if I say too much. And most of the things that I say about it seem really trite and cliched to me. So I hesitate to say them. But simply just that there's some the idea of accumulation is interesting to me as a social idea. Maybe I could just say that.
One thing John, I think I can add
Question over there.
to that is one thing I guess I'll quote you. you wrote, sanding through veneer deliberately is like a forced confession. And the objects in which we're sitting on is sanded veneer. And for me, I feel like your work may be hodgepodge? Is that what you call it? Collage?
He said collage.
Collage. And I agree.
I accept that.
And I agree. But what's apparent to me is the things you value. You make all these objects yourself, in which you choose what pieces of wood, what pieces of weird suede get combined. And it applies.
I do have help. I have assistants
Okay.
that also make decisions, which
Okay.
is important.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you for that. And but it's also like you're making your values apparent, right? Like there's this choice of sanding down. You can like anyone can sand down a graffitied table, right? Years and years and years of bored kids, or maybe just like really anxious or really hungry for knowledge youth that just scribble onto a tabletop. There is this choice of removing that to make it new, to make it clean, to make it pristine. But you deliberately choose to honor that in this way, and to highlight it. And I could see how that can seem like ruin porn, but it's also this level of like this history, right? That and this presence that was there for a very long time, and there's that choice to remove it, but you didn't. And the way you talk about quilting, right, becomes these pieces that each, in their own right, tell a story, but combined together become this new object, this new thing, or this new opportunity. So I feel like that resonates a lot with your work, even though you may or may not know how to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, one thing that springs to mind that I was going to say more about in the talk, but I felt pressure to get through it. The way in which the landscape, if you imagine how many people died on this very spot, how many people fell in love on this very spot, how much sex was had on this very spot, how many transactions or whatever, like every single spot on the planet is rife with history, but we decide what we want to call history, right? It's a narrative authored project. And in a way, I feel like the objects for me in some way resemble that aspect of just the natural world, that things happen on top of other things, on top of other things, and a lot of it gets buried. Sometimes some of it remains. Sometimes you see some hint of a thing that happened a long time ago, and that's just endlessly fascinating to me.
Yeah, John Mijay, I want to thank you so much. I'm going to ask that we close because we're going to lose our room for another use at some point tonight. But thank you so much for your talk and images and conversation, and thanks everybody else for your engagement.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.